The judge thought she was just another cheeky girl from the streets. But within minutes, the courtroom fell silent. 18-year-old Noelle Brooks, accused of carjacking, began to dismantle the case as if she were wearing the judge's robe herself. What seemed like a simple case to close turned into an expose of racial bias and judicial manipulation that was hard to ignore. "Stand up, defendant." My heart was pounding like a drum, but my face betrayed not a hint of fear. I stood up, looking straight ahead. The courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop. The judge, whose surname was Hartwell, white, gray-haired, with the same condescension in his eyes that I had seen in school from those who thought I was worthless, glanced at me over his glasses, as if I were just another tired statistic, not a human being. "Noelle Brooks, 18 years old. Charged with car theft and resisting arrest," he said, flipping through the file. Not a great start to adulthood. A soft laugh rippled through the courtroom. The court clerk, the prosecutor, even my public defender, everyone seemed to have already decided I was guilty. It was convenient for them to think that way. A black girl from the south side of Chicago with no money, no status. It all fit. But they didn't know who my mother was. My mother had worked as a paralegal her entire life. She taught me to listen and see what was hidden between the lines, in documents, in testimony, in the way the prosecutor presented evidence. Everything I know about the law, I learned not from books, but from life, listening to my mother in the evenings as she recounted how another young man was convicted based on fingerprints on the hood of a car, even though he wasn't even driving. I didn't plan to be here in this courtroom. But if fate had thrown me this dirty script, I wasn't going to stand by silently and watch them bury me. When Prosecutor Mason stood up and began reading his speech, his voice rang out with the confidence of a television presenter. He painted a picture. I was allegedly caught in a stolen car, an expensive black Infiniti, and I was trying to escape. Fingerprints on the steering wheel, alleged photos from cameras, confident identification by an officer. It all sounded solid, convincing. But I heard something else: weaknesses. I noticed that the judge was about to close the case before my lawyer had a chance to say anything. And I couldn't let that happen. "Your Honor," I said calmly, even though my heart was in my throat, "I want to represent myself." The judge raised an eyebrow, smiled. The prosecutor snorted. Even my lawyer looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." "Well, this will be interesting," Hartwell said, turning back to the case. I stepped forward and said, "The prosecutor claims that Officer Bradley personally saw me behind the wheel during the arrest?" "Yes. He clearly stated that in his report," Mason replied. "Excellent. Then I demand a review of the GPS logs from his patrol car. Because the surveillance cameras on Marshall Avenue, where I was allegedly caught driving, did not record his car within a 4-block radius at the time indicated." The gallery buzzed. The judge looked up. The prosecutor fell silent. "Are you claiming that the officer lied in his report?" "I am claiming that either the report was falsified or the officer was not where he said he was. And we have a way to prove it." That was the first breakthrough. I saw the prosecutor start to lose control. The judge could no longer ignore me. But I knew this was only the beginning, because I hadn't played my trump card yet. I felt the air in the room grow heavier. Every eye was on me, as if they were waiting for me to break down, to get tangled up in my words, as often happens when someone tries to play outside the rules of the system. But I knew that my word was not just my defense. It was my chance to change the game. "And now," I said, turning to the judge, "allow me to make one more request. I want the court to summon the owner of the car, Mr. Terry Oldham, for questioning." "And what do you think that will accomplish?" asked the prosecutor. I took out the folder, pulled out the printout of the police report, and read aloud. "The man who stole my car was tall, white, with red hair." Mr. Oldham's original words, recorded by the officer on the night of the incident. I looked at the prosecutor. "Why did you forget to mention that?" The prosecutor turned pale. A murmur rose again in the courtroom. People were no longer whispering. They were looking at me, then at the prosecutor. It was already clear that something was wrong with this case. The judge leaned forward, now listening to me intently. "You're saying that the police report describes a completely different person?" "That's right, Your Honor. And I demand that this evidence be taken into account in the case." "Your Honor," the prosecutor interrupted, "her fingerprints were found in the car. That fact is indisputable." Yes, my fingerprints were there. But does that prove that I was driving when the car was stolen? I paused, allowing their confidence to waver. I was with friends that evening. We stopped by the car because someone said the door was unlocked. I touched the handle. It was stupid. But I didn't get in the car. I didn't steal it. I looked over at the jury. Their eyes were no longer cold. One of them, a gray-haired man in the third row, nodded slightly. Maybe he remembered his own daughter. Or maybe he remembered a time when he himself had made a mistake. And also, I added, I would like to draw the court's attention to the fact that the expert who analyzed the fingerprints is not present today. He was not summoned. This means that I am unable to ask any questions about how the evidence was stored. Without this information, how can we claim that everything was done according to procedure? It was a controlled blow. Strong, well-founded, unexpected. The prosecutor began to rummage through his papers. The judge sighed and put down his pen. These questions are valid, he said slowly. And if even part of what you say is confirmed, the case will not be as simple as I thought. I knew it wasn't a victory. Not yet. But for the first time in all this time, I wasn't seen as just another problematic black girl from the ghetto. For the first time, they saw me as a person. And the judge saw me as an opponent. I also knew something else. If I managed to throw them off balance now, it would get even louder. Because I had a move that would turn everything upside down. The break dragged on. I stood by the window in the hallway, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. It was raining outside. People were running with umbrellas, as if fleeing from everything. I had nowhere to run. I was already on the battlefield. Mom approached quietly. She didn't hug me. We weren't the type to cry and squeeze hands in dramatic moments. But her voice was like armor. You have a once-in-a-lifetime chance, Noelle. Not to justify yourself, but to prove that you're not just innocent. That this whole game was rigged against you before the first move was even made. I know. I haven't played my trump card yet, I said, clutching a small flash drive in my palm. When we re-entered the courtroom, I noticed how the atmosphere had changed. People were no longer looking down on me. Most were wary, some openly curious. But there was something else. I no longer seemed like a typical defendant to them. I was something that had gotten out of control. And that scared them. I stepped before the judge. Your Honor, I have additional evidence that I believe will change the nature of this case. This is surveillance footage from the Sungo gas station, taken that night. My mother and I obtained it through a civil request. The police ignored this recording. I submitted the flash drive through the court clerk. Did you have the opportunity to submit this material earlier? Judge Hartwell asked. I did not have access to the evidence, which, as it turned out, the prosecution deliberately ignored. Prosecutor Mason no longer hid his anxiety. His face paled, and his hands began to frantically flip through documents he hadn't even opened before. This is new material. We have no confirmation of its authenticity. Its authenticity is confirmed by the date, time, and location. And most importantly, by its content, I replied. A video appeared on the screen. It was nighttime. An Infiniti was parked at a gas station. The driver, a red-haired white guy in a hoodie, got out and walked toward a store, leaving the car running. A few minutes later, another guy, also white, got into the car and drove away. The time was 9:14 p.m., the exact moment of the kidnapping. I pointed. That's not me. You can see that. The courtroom fell silent. Several jurors leaned closer to the screen. Someone in the gallery whispered, "It's obvious that's not her." The judge looked at the prosecutor. Do you have an explanation? Mason cleared his throat. His voice no longer sounded confident. This video was not handed over to the police, perhaps for technical reasons, or because it was considered irrelevant. You consider a video showing the real kidnapper, who has nothing to do with the defendant, to be irrelevant? The judge's voice was sharp. Your Honor, I said, stepping forward again, the police had a description of a white criminal. They had GPS data showing that Officer Bradley was not at the scene. And now they have video. Why was I in custody? Because I was in the next block? Because my skin is darker? I paused. Everyone was looking at me. This isn't just a mistake. It's a pattern. The system sees someone who fits and stops looking. This is racial bias, and it can ruin lives. It almost ruined mine. But how many others couldn't defend themselves? The judge looked away. His face was no longer stone. Something resembling shame appeared there. "The court is going to deliberate," he said quietly and disappeared behind the door with the jury. The courtroom remained in silent tension. I returned to my seat. I sat down. And then, for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. My mother put her hand on my shoulder. Silently. But that touch meant more than 1,000 words. "You did it," she said silently. I was shaking. Not from fear, but from how close I had been to collapse. One more video, and I would have been in prison. Because of someone's prejudice. Because of silence. Because of indifference. But I didn't stay silent. I didn't break down. I made them see. The weight was unbearable. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear every creak of the benches, every deep breath. The jury went to deliberate, and the judge followed them. I sat there, clutching the edge of the table, feeling every pulse in my fingers. "How long can they deliberate?" My mother whispered, pressing herself against me. "As long as they need to. But the longer it takes, the worse it is for the prosecution," I replied, not taking my eyes off the door behind which the people who now held my fate in their hands had disappeared. I remembered the words of a judge from my mother's work, which she had once quoted: "Truth is not a matter of evidence. It is a matter of who controls it." But today, for the first time, I felt that sometimes the truth does find a way. 40 minutes later, the door opened. The jurors returned. Behind them was Judge Hartwell. His expression slightly changed. He was not as confident, not as cold. His face resembled that of a man who had just looked in the mirror a little longer than he wanted to. He sat down, straightened his back, looked at me, not condescendingly, more humanly. "Ms. Brooks, the jury has reached a unanimous decision." His voice was quiet but clear. "Due to the lack of conclusive evidence, numerous procedural violations, and the new testimony you have provided, the court finds you not guilty on all counts." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then someone in the courtroom, I think it was a girl in the back row, exhaled loudly, "Oh my God." I sat back down in my chair, feeling my legs go a little weak. My head was spinning, but not from fear, from relief. From the fact that the system hadn't crushed me, that I had stood my ground. "This case is closed," the judge muttered and stood up. But before leaving, he paused once more. He looked at me and said, "Ms. Brooks, you have potential. Perhaps you should consider a career in law." I nodded but did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say. It was because those words sounded like an attempt to absolve himself of guilt. Like a belated admission that I could have been convicted simply because I looked suspicious. The judge left. The jury followed him. And I remained standing in the center of the courtroom, where I had just won a war. Not a case, a war. Reporters approached me with their cameras, microphones, and loud questions. "Noel, how did you manage to expose the police's lies? How do you feel after your victory? Do you plan to sue the police or the district attorney's office?" I didn't answer. I walked past them like a gust of wind. This day wasn't about glory. This day was about the truth surviving. My mom was waiting for me on the steps. She wasn't crying. But when I approached her, she grabbed me so tightly, as if she was afraid I would disappear. "You didn't just stand your ground. You broke their backs." For the first time in a long time, I saw the system crumble. I hugged her tightly. "But how many more are there like me?" I whispered. "How many don't have a lawyer mom or the strength to speak up?" She looked me in the eyes and said, "That's why you can't stop." And I already knew that this trial would not be the last. Next time, I would not walk into the courtroom as a suspect. I would walk in as someone who would defend others. The next morning, I woke up not to the alarm clock, but to silence. That special silence that only comes after a storm. When there are no more alarming phone calls, court summonses, or nighttime fears. Only the light coming through the window and a deep realization, I am still here. Free. My mother was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, something new in her eyes. Not just pride. She saw in me the future she had once denied herself. "Have you decided what you're going to do next?" she asked, without looking up from her cup. "Yes. I'm going to law school." I knew it. For the first time in a long time, her voice didn't tremble. "But I ask one thing. Don't let the system break you from the inside. They know how to do it quietly." I nodded. I already knew that was true. The system isn't just laws. It's habits, prejudices, views that are passed down from generation to generation like an inheritance. And if you want to change the rules, you have to change yourself first. Your silence, your passivity, A few days later, I was invited to speak to students at a local college. The topic was the voice that changes. And even though I didn't have a degree yet, I was introduced as someone who stood up against injustice and defeated the system on its own turf. I stood in front of a room full of young faces, dark, light, doubtful, inquisitive, and I began to speak. I could have been sentenced to 10 years, not because there was any evidence, but because I fit the mold. Because in the police report, I was the one who looked guilty, but I had a voice, and I used it. But imagine, how many of those who are now in prison didn't have that voice? Didn't have a mother who knew how to seek the truth? How many of them remained silent, not because they were guilty, but because no one listened to them? The room was silent. Justice is not a guarantee. It is a struggle, every day, and not just in the courts, but in schools, on the streets, in hospitals, in your minds. Because racism is not just an insult. It is a way of looking at people. It is doubt. It is the assumption that someone is less because they look different. I ended with words that have become my motto. You can be the ones who remain silent, or you can be the ones who break the silence. Today is your choice. The following week, the news reported that Officer Bradley had been suspended from duty. The prosecutor's office launched an internal investigation. Mason, the prosecutor who had built a case out of thin air, resigned for personal reasons. It wasn't my victory. It was just the first crack in an old wall. I stood on the steps of the same building where I had almost lost my freedom. Now I had a folder in my hands and an acceptance letter to law school. My mother was standing next to me. Behind us were young people holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and Noel showed us the truth. And cameras. Again. But now I wasn't running away from them. Half a year has passed. When I walk into the law school auditorium now, no one knows my story right away. They see a girl with curly hair, a laptop, and books. They don't see the surveillance camera that didn't show me. They don't hear the prosecutor who built a case on lies. They can't imagine how I stood in court, not as a student, but as a defendant facing 10 years in prison. And you know what? That's fine, because I don't want to be remembered just as the one who won the case. I want to be remembered as the one who started to break things. In the system, in the silence, in myself. One day, a teacher approached me. She teaches a course on ethics and justice. "Were you really that girl from Chicago? Noel Brooks?" I nodded. She looked a little embarrassed. I read about the case. The judge, the GPS, the gas station video. It was brave. Very brave. I didn't answer. Not out of pride, but out of awareness. Because being brave isn't heroic. Sometimes it's just not having a choice. After class, I opened my laptop. I had been invited to speak at a regional conference on racial bias in the justice system. I read the message and thought, what if what I did was just the beginning? Because, in reality, the story doesn't end with the words, "You are not guilty." It begins after them. I was invited to participate in a documentary project. The director asked me, "Would you like to go back to that courtroom? To show where it all happened?" I looked at him. For the first time in a long time, I felt afraid. No, I don't want to go back there. But I want them to know I'm not afraid anymore. That day, I recorded a short video. No editing. Just me, the camera, and my words. My name is Noel Brooks. And I was almost put in jail because of how I looked. Not because of what I did. The truth got me out. But I ask myself every day, how many people like me didn't have a camera, didn't have a flash drive, didn't have a voice? I learned the law to protect myself. Now I want to teach others to protect themselves too. Because the truth isn't just what happened. It's what we decide to no longer keep silent about. Today, I am working on an initiative, a legal club for teenagers from disadvantaged neighborhoods. We examine real cases. We teach them how to read charges, how not to sign false statements, how to know their rights. Once, I asked a 15-year-old boy in class, "What do you do when the police stop you?" He replied, "I call my mom. But she tells me to keep quiet and agree to everything. Because it's better to be humiliated than dead." I will remember those words forever. That's why I do what I do. So that next time, mothers won't teach their children how to survive. They'll be able to teach them how to defend themselves.